The topic for our webinar today is human rights. Why is it so difficult for businesses to get this right? As the name certainly suggests, human rights should be inalienable for every human being beyond the remit of any employer or government. But in reality, human rights have often been denied on the basis of race, religion, gender, caste, or sexual orientation. As our world moves increasingly into the digital realm, due considerations on the right to data privacy, data security, and the right to personal data protection are becoming increasingly pertinent. For corporate leaders today, the intersection of human rights and business has raised several critical questions. Companies need to respect human rights not only because it is the ethical thing to do, but because it is the smart thing to do as well, to avoid lawsuits, reputational damage, and losing the business of conscientious customers, suppliers, and partners. Our speaker today will address some of these urgent questions about human rights in the business world, emphasizing on how businesses need to ethically interact with employees, suppliers, partners, and society. He will discuss issues like treatment of labor, working conditions in supply chains, data privacy on social media, and many more. Our renowned speaker for this evening is Salil Tripathi, who is an Indian journalist and writer. Salil studied at the New Era School in Mumbai, and graduated from Sindham College at the University of Bombay. He later obtained his master's in business administration from the Amos Tuck School of Business Administration at Dartmouth College in the United States. Salil is currently the chair of PEN International's Writers in Prison Committee and has been a senior visiting fellow for business and human rights at the Kennedy School, Harvard University. He's also an advisor to several global initiatives involving business and human rights. Salil writes on politics, economics, literature, and social trends. He has written for, and his articles have appeared in several reputed publications, including but not limited to India Today, The Washington Post, The New York Times, The New Yorker, The New Republic, The Guardian, The Independent, New Statesman, The Spectator, and Prospect, to name just a few. Salil's books include Offense, The Hindu Case, The Colonel Who Would Not Repent, Detours, Songs of the Open Road, and also a forthcoming book on the Gujaratis. In addition to being a renowned human rights busybody, he is also an accomplished poet. Today, we may also get to hear some of his acerbic and incisive poetry. So welcome, Salil. Welcome to our webinar, and thank you for being here.
Thank you.
In conversation with Salil is Professor Chirag Trivedi from the Amrut Modi School of Management, Ahmedabad University. Chirag is a faculty in the communications area with the School of Management, and his focus of research and doctoral studies was on elitism in Gujarati literature, a post-colonial inquiry into the shaping of the literary canon in Gujarat. Chirag has been presenting and publishing research papers in national and international conferences and journals for the last 15 years. He has also been invited to host guest sessions, conduct workshops and seminars in the area of self-awareness, personal development, and effective teaching skills by various reputed institutions. Chirag has been associated as a passionate volunteer with Samvedna Foundation Ahmedabad, an NGO that works for education and nutrition for children from humble backgrounds. He also voluntarily offers editorial services on the editorial board of Wahi, Journal of Poetry, Ritual, and Multilingual Expression of Society. His interests lie in identity politics in literature, partition literature, Dalit literature, and culture studies. He is presently involved in teaching courses on literature, cultural studies, business communication, and gender sensitization. Chirag fondly takes on creative writing and translation of literary texts and his poetic expressions and translations have got published in reputed poetry magazines such as Wahi and Kavita. So, without taking any more time, may I now request Chirag to please begin the conversation with Salil, and welcome once again.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Bijal. Come to think of human rights and the phrasing of the topic, why is it so difficult for businesses to get it right? And I get reminded of these famous lines by the great poet Tennyson from In Memoriam, when he says, so many worlds, so much to do, so little done, such things to be. So many worlds, so much to do. From right to equality, right to freedom, right against exploitation, right to freedom of religion, cultural and educational rights, right to constitutional remedies, right to health services and safety, right to be free from slavery, not to miss the right to be free from torture, the right to be free from retroactive application of penal laws, right to privacy, too, among many others, the most fundamental one, right to live. So little done, such things to be, isn't it? And that's why I welcome Salil Bhai. Salil Bhai is a writer and a journalist whom I also have been following. He is a poet of my favorite galaxy. Thank you, Salil Bhai, for joining us for this conversation. And to take a very simple introduction to this topical phrasing a little ahead, and for facts, let me share with everyone present here that right to equality is the most violated human right in the world. The poor, the marginalized, the excluded are not just losing their humanity day after day in the present times, trying times that we may want to call it, but are actually being denied livelihood, jobs, and security, are actually denied the right to, shall we call it, human dignity. And in addition to this, on the other hand, come to think of business, and one would get reminded of Milton Friedman. One would get reminded of his maxim, which says, business of every business is business. Does business of every business, in some sense, still remain to be only business? Can businesses afford it? Well, we know for a fact that every resource is commodified, plants and seeds are patented, water is privatized, and sections of human population are robbed of their means to create and sustain their livelihoods. And putting all of this in one idea, Salil Bhai, uh, from the day I started putting my ideas together about the phrasing of today's conversation's topic, why is it difficult for businesses to get it right? I realized that the most significant word that is used in this topic is difficult. What really makes it difficult? There are so many concerns, there are so many considerations to be brought in. And that's why it is probably really very difficult to think about it historically. Are these perils of radical revolutions in the name of economic growth? I mean, industrialization, globalization, digitization. Or should the questions be, aren't this the perils of radical revolutions in the name of economic growth? I do think the engines of modernization have handed out to us modern problems, like the ever increasing gap between the rich and the poor. Everybody keeps talking about it, and yet the gap is increasing. Exploitation of the labor, or inhuman conditions in which workers have to carry out the work in almost all the sectors, ignoring safety standards to produce cheap goods, threats to data privacy and data protection, and the increasing global digital inequality. This interblending, or should I call it blurring, of the physical and the digital and the biological worlds have voiced concerns, severe ones, about almost all disciplines, almost all economies, and all industries, and have also challenged our ideas about what means to be human, humane, humanness, and what do we mean by humanity. And it is not just this much, is it? The rights of formal and informal labor, the ongoing discussions on women empowerment, and yet never ending debates on maternity leave or menstrual leave or equal wages, or questions around the inclusion of the disabled and conducive working conditions to be provided to them, inclusion and, in fact, easy acceptance of the queer in an organization's workforce, the right of the indigenous groups and the forest dwellers. Are these considerations, on other hand, if I talk about primarily the state's lookout, is it only the government's obligation to provide for? Well, is the gap between sharing the profits with the shareholders, and if I talk about businesses, and creating value for all its stakeholders, still refusing to be bridged? What all human rights then these businesses should acknowledge as their prime responsibility? I come to you, Salil Bhai, having put all these questions and all these concerns, uh, having specified them loud and clear. I come to you with your take on the topic. I mean, how would you approach the topic to begin with?
So, how much time do we have? Because each of
Yeah,
the questions you raised is the topic of hours long discussion here. So you're right to raise them, because it is indeed complex, if not difficult, because in a way it is not difficult. Actually, human rights is very simple. Treat other people as you would like to be treated yourself. That's basically what human rights is. Once you take that into account, and the other is that novel by Harper Lee, To Kill a
To Kill a
Mockingbird.
Mockingbird.
There is a very nice line about Atticus Finch, who tells his children that, walk in the shoes of the weakest person and see how it feels, and then try to modify your actions. Gandhi said something similar, that his last talisman was what? That, when you think of any social change or any move or any step, consider the impact on the most vulnerable, most poor, most marginalized person, and try to make sure if the step you're about to take is going to make his or her life different. And if it's positive, don't think. And he says, then all your doubts will melt away, because the assumption is that there is a moral force. So there's a very strong moral aspect to human rights. But if we try to understand and deconstruct what it is, it's basically about power. I mean, people in the world, entities in the world have power. Governments have power, businesses have power, religious organizations have power, NGOs have power, institutions have power. And we individuals do not have that power. And this is a claim, right? Is a claim on someone with power to make sure that I, as a duty bearer, is respected. I want X. Somebody has the gift to make it enables this environment in which I can have the X. And what I have is not a need, not a plea for help. And what the other person is doing is not charity, but it's based on rights and law. Now, businesses are right in saying that, why should we bother? Because it's the state's responsibility. And legally, that's the right answer. That if you look at the international human rights law, it's the governments of the world which actually sign up to international treaties. It's the Indian government which signed the Genocide Convention, the Indian government which signed the International Covenant for Civil and Political Rights, the Indian government which signs, the Convention Against Racial Discrimination. You and I cannot. Then the Indian government will end up creating enabling laws, and those laws will regulate our behavior. So it is indeed the government which takes those steps. However, there are lots of ways in which companies act which have an impact on human rights. When they decide to hire only people from a particular religion or caste, it has an impact on human rights. If they create policies which make it harder for women who are working to return to work after they have a child, and so that they come back but they can't stay long enough, that's a problem. If they do not know how to deal with bullying of lesbian or gay employees, that's a problem. All these things, if they don't know how many Dalits they have in the organization, that is a problem. So I think companies have an enormous impact on the society, when it decides to pollute or not pollute the environment, when it sells products in a particular way, if it advertises the ways in which, are sexist, or which present women in a very voyeuristic way, that creates certain and perpetuates certain images in society. So there's a rights element there too. How you're treating, are you treating people with dignity? That's what it boils down to. And within the workforce itself, whether there are enough opportunities for everyone to write. So the impact of businesses activities can cause or contribute to adverse impacts on human rights. And if that is the case, then they need to take steps. And what helps them are the enabling laws. There are laws on equality, there are laws on product safety, health and safety. So it's a combination of what the companies must do. The companies cannot simply say that, oh, this is a problem for the government because they have signed the treaties and my job is only to make money. It doesn't work that way.
Well, I do completely take that. But then on the other hand, I also do feel that it's a very thin line to uh, make that difference, make that distinction quite clearly. It is very difficult for a company, if I were an owner of the company, or it is very difficult for the shareholders to decipher how much of that profit engine
Yeah. So
will
there is a
have to be steamed up, and and what are all other things at stake. What has happened is, I mean, I'm not sure. I mean, I would request you for giving us that information, that how much of all of these companies have been able to prepare some kind of policies.
hmm.
On the other hand, I do know that the government of India is in the process of finalizing the National Action Plan on business human rights to ensure businesses are sustainable, but also responsible towards rights of communities that are being impacted. But that is just a document. That's a zero draft that has been proposed and has been in public domain since 2018. It was supposed to see the light of the day after getting finalized, after all the reviews and suggestions, by March 2020. And for the reason of the pandemic or whatever other reasons, it has yet not got finalized. And we are still waiting for the government of India to inform the businesses about what should be the human rights that they will have to carefully build into their policies. What should those policy considerations be?
So two parts to your question. First, I will give an example about where companies can act in and why do they need to act. And it's related to the second part of your question, that where the whole assumption here, again, if we were to accept that business is a shared responsibility for human rights, that makes it easier to address it. Because there are times when governments are unwilling to act and sometimes they're unable to act. Unwilling to act, a very good example is, of course, the apartheid era South Africa, where the government actually believed that white people are superior and black people are not, they're inferior, and browns and the Chinese and they've Cape Malays in South Africa, the Malays from Indonesia and Malaysia who are in the Cape province, and they are inferior. Now, in that context, what companies decided, they could not overthrow, it was not their mandate, capacity, or expertise to overthrow the government in South Africa. What they instead did was that they decided on implementing something called the Sullivan Principle. Now, Sullivan was a black Philadelphia preacher who was on the board of General Motors in the 1970s. And he came up with this principle which said that within our workplace, we will make sure that there is no discrimination. Within our own offices, if there's a black manager with a white subordinate, that's okay. The black manager can tell off a white subordinate if his work is not up to the standard. That would never happen outside because South Africa was a different place. But within the company, it was the empowerment of that individual. They would get opportunities to move. They desegregated. So in South Africa at that time, if you remember the old images, there were beaches for the white people, beaches for the black people, beaches for the colored people. I mean, Durban, I've been there, and you have beaches with white area, black area, Indian area. That within the company, no, the cafeteria, you had to eat wherever you got the table and you sat next to whoever it was with you. So in a way, it was breaking down the barrier. So a lot of companies did that. And what Nelson Mandela said when he came to power was that I did want companies to leave. But if they stayed, if they did this, they did something right. So that brings me to the next one. So there are unwilling governments and the unable government where they don't have resources, which is in a way the Indian example of the CSR budget, that companies are told to pay X percentage for CSR. And you could very well argue that there is a problem. Why don't the companies simply pay a tax? Because what this does is it distorts development priorities. Now, suppose, for example, for me, the idea of CSR is to feed school children. And 10 other companies also feel the same way. So every company in that area, in a mining area, provides only school meals. But maybe another company should actually think another way and create an opportunity for underprivileged children for playgrounds or for uniforms, or to make sure that they do not have to go to work and there is no child. So that comprehensive planning has to happen with the participation of people, where the state has a role. So as soon as the government abdicates its responsibility to the companies, it becomes a problem. And I think that's why what the companies have to do with the national voluntary guidelines is that they are only indicators, markers. They say it would be desirable to do this. Unless there is a very good system of monitoring and implementation and reporting and some kind of incentive and disincentive built in, so that companies know what they have to do, and also go beyond the listed companies. This only covers listed companies on the stock market. What happens to companies which are not listed? The private paydees and so on. These are the ways in which you have to unpack, because every organization has an impact on human rights. Even the tea stall at a dhaba on the road has an impact, because they might be hiring children. And you cannot say that, oh, we don't cover that. There has to be a mechanism which looks at every aspect.
Yeah, I completely agree, because I also do get to see that companies are intentionally or not so very intentionally blurring between the CSR activities and actual acknowledgement and implementation of human rights of their stakeholders. So in the name of CSR, if the attention to human rights is getting diverted, that's one thing. And there would be many examples, I'm sure, that you could share with us. But I was also interested in knowing about...
The problem there is interesting. What happens is that you have a company which may be raising a forest because it wants to access minerals and leading to forced displacement of a community. And then it plants eucalyptus trees elsewhere and provides some kind of school meals to the children who have been displaced. Now, the argument that a human rights community and human rights activists will make is this, that it's nice that you're providing food. It's nice that you're doing all these wonderful things, but one does not pay for the other. There's no cost benefit. And you cannot apply that accounting tool, which is possible to do in some ways in environment, that, if you remove a particular forest, you replant trees, and that kind of a comparison can probably be made. Although some environmentalists will bristle because an old forest is more important than a plantation crop. So I accept that. But when you're talking about human rights, it's not, you cannot say that we won't give you trade union rights, but we will give you a Founders Day where everybody will get a gift to every employee. That's not how it works.
Yeah, I mean, it's like hurting a friend by saying rude words to him and then going to the temple and breaking a coconut.
Yeah.
But I'm sure there would be some positive stories, some companies, and in India or definitely outside India, where they would be setting up an example that many other companies would learn from.
So a very good
please.
example of what happened in India with the Section 377 case, where you had the Delhi High Court with, Justice Shah and Muralidhar giving a judgment, then the Supreme Court going against it, then the Supreme Court taking a revision. Now, in that period of about 2009 to 16, about 6 or 7 years, when criminalization was reinstated in India, at that time, what happened? You had excellent companies in India, which basically took out public demonstrations of support for overturning the law. You had Tanish, the watch company, you had Hidesign, the fashion company, Mantra, the retail company, Amul Butter. I mean, there are several such companies, and I think even Jensen, the paint company, Jensen and Nicholson, there were lots of ads that came out which are publicly endorsing and supporting the idea that love has no barriers and you cannot have these kinds of laws which restrict. So I think there are times when companies can speak out, even though it is not their role to do so. I mean, it's that kind of public advocacy is a good thing.
But haven't we then, on the other hand, been challenged by what is happening with the same companies, be it Amul or be it Tanishq, as you mentioned? I just get reminded of the recent raw around the Tanishq's ad campaign. I think they were probably bringing a good message out, but it got completely typed under a misunderstood idea of love jihad. And I mean, even love jihad is not the right term to be used.
Yeah. I mean, it's basically it's a myth, because when the National Commission for Women looked for statistics, they couldn't find any case that could be characterized as love jihad to start with, and it's a jihad against love rather than love jihad is the way I see it to start with. But more important than that, I think it's worth noting is that the people who wanted the ad to be withdrawn were actually arguing against the constitution, because the constitution of India does not prohibit marriage between a person of one religion with another one. There's no such law in India. So when you ask an ad company to withdraw the ad because it's basically upholding the Constitution of India in a way, or in spirit of the Constitution of India, then by opposing it, you're being unconstitutional. And to use a very popular word these days, anti-national. This is the real anti-nationalism in a way. And so it is the role of the state to restrain not the company, but the activists. But the state was silent in this picture. So I think that's the problem here. And I think that the company took what was probably a sensible decision. It didn't want its stores to be attacked, its employees to be attacked, its employees' names to be made public, and if they were Muslims to be made problematic and so on. So I think that is a genuine problem that companies have to face, that companies can act. Like in the US, for example, the president, Donald Trump, the last president, he was quite against laws on transgender and, against the marriage equality and issues such as that. But when the case came up before the Supreme Court, 200 American companies signed an amicus brief basically saying that it's fine to, have same-sex marriages. When one state was going to pass a law which was called the bathroom law in, I think, North Carolina, PayPal, Deutsche Bank, these were the companies that pulled out of the state, that, you have discriminatory policies. We cannot be in your state. Climate change, again, Paris Accord, Exxon and companies like that were supporting the climate accord in Paris. So there are companies which do speak up. I see a question coming about CEO activism, and that's why I'm anticipating that here, I think from Sudhir Bhai. And it's absolutely right. I mean, you do have to, company CEOs have to speak up because it's in their interest, I mean, a company that discriminates between one set of customers and another is going to narrow its market. If a company went to South Africa and said that, oh, we will support apartheid, that means you don't want black consumers. That's 80% of the country or 60% of the country. So being discriminatory is actually bad for a company. It's not good for the company, although it may be good for the people temporarily in power.
Yeah, but if I just talk about the laws from the very implementation point of view, while talking with a friend in the same university who teaches subjects on law, I realize the point that he was trying to make is like, would not some such legislations as the labor codes or child labor law, maternity benefit law, and land acquisition act, or recognition of forest rights act, pose some kind of a conflict in the very implementation of this national action plan and the guidelines that the government is preparing? For instance, the Child Labor Prohibition and Regulation Amendment Act allows children to work in family enterprises after school hours, almost. I mean, absolutely. But yet, it is like that, and that does raise concerns about some kind of possibility of increasing invisible form of child labor.
Yeah.
Will
so
that?
there are two aspects to it. I mean, when you look at the ILO, the International Labour Organization, and its prohibition for child labor, it's also not an absolute position. What it says is that exploitative forms and the worst forms of child labor are prohibited. It does not say that there should be no child labor, because that's an ideal position. And getting there is difficult. I used to, about 20 years ago, I used to work at Amnesty International in London. And I remember at that time, we had a Bangladeshi woman who was the head of Amnesty International, my very good friend, Irene Khan. And she used to tell me that, it's very easy to tell Bangladeshi sports goods manufacturers or Pakistani sports goods manufacturers to stop employing children in making footballs in Pakistan or making bricks in Bangladesh or apparel in Bangladesh. But if those factories remove them, what happens to those children is that they go to worse forms of work. Now, what should a company do in that case? That's the real dilemma here. And I think what the companies have to do, I mean, this is an opinion, I mean, it's not tested and all that, is make sure that if children have to work, to take steps to ensure that it's really light, it is entirely legal, and not at the cost of their nutrition, not at the cost of their schooling, and not at the cost of their other rights, including the right to play. So what tends to happen, and this is what has happened in some industries, is that the children work for only 3 hours a day. Now you might say that 3 hours a day is also very much, and I agree, it is 3 hours a day. I mean, you can't say that child labor is okay because it's part of our tradition, because it's not the part of tradition of any country to make children work. So that's, but you can't go there overnight. And if you try to go there overnight, what you're going to have is probably worse forms of exploitation of children. And so a very graduated way of system, which is not something that's going to take 50 years, but 5 years or so, with a plan to make sure that, you know, if children have to work, or create mechanisms of hiring the parents and, or, you know, hiring other people in the family, and create a situation in which those children do not have to work. And those are the kind of responsibilities that companies have to take because of state failures. So the laws are quite right. And also things such as internship, you know, I mean, karigari as we know it, you know, whether it is manual work or even it could be a, you know, if there's a software engineer and he or she teaches his daughter how to code, and she starts coding and creates apps and she's 13 years old, is that child labor? No, it is not child labor. I mean, we cheer it as entrepreneurship. So we have to also get rid of our class biases here when we look at what is child labor, and say that, you know, either you don't do it at all, or if you do it, make sure that there is no cruel, inhuman or degrading treatment, and it is not at the cost of opportunities that the children need, so that they do not remain in child labor or that kind of labor for the rest of their life.
Well, that's quite different a thought, quite different an ideology. And but because you mentioned, it's a very important comment that we will have to get rid of our class biases, and we'll have to see how it, if it can work for one particular class, why would it not work positively and productively for another particular class? And since we talk about biases, I think, yeah, these class biases or the caste biases or biases against various different minority groups, religious biases, in the end, then is it not entirely cultural? And therefore, wouldn't these business houses and the people who are responsible for implementing human rights in business happily blame it upon either the government that has been happening so far, or the larger abstraction called culture? And that's why leave it unattended there. So how much of the cultural is going to become extremely difficult to challenge that businesses can manage to overcome, and how can they overcome that?
So there is a, I mean, a straightforward theoretical answer, which is simple. Implementing is the hard part. But the simple thing is, you can blame it on the government. But if you always blame it on the government, you will still end up with an inequitable and inequitous system within your own company. And you want to move beyond that. Similarly, if you say that it's cultural and therefore, you know, don't do it, you are going to miss out. I mean, there are broad generalizations being made, you know, that people of X community are not hardworking, or people of Y community are not fit to do certain kinds of jobs, or, you know, women cannot do X amount of work because they're weaker. Now, if you do that, you end up getting a suboptimal workforce because you simply don't know. Again, going back to the South African example, Donald Bradman, the famous Australian cricketer, had gone to South Africa in 1971 to figure out the apartheid system. And the prime minister at that time was John Foster. And apparently he told Bradman that, Bradman said that, why don't you have black people in the South African cricket team? And he said, oh, they're of lower intelligence. That was Foster's response. So Bradman looked back and said, have you heard of Gary Sobers? That was his reply at that time. And he comes back, and he was the head of the Australian Cricket Board, and he said, we will not send a team to South Africa until they have a multiracial integrated country. And they did that. So I think that's the point here, that when people say that you make these cultural assumptions and go along with it, companies, they are going to be the loser because they're not going to get the best crop of talent. And I think it is in their interest. And yes, of course, you know, if the state says do X and you only stay with X, then you will remain at X level. I think what companies ultimately have to do is look at the broader human rights framework, broader human rights standards and international standards, adhere and abide by those, or the local ones, whichever are superior. Not whichever is inferior, but whichever is superior, because a net benefit in the longer run to the society and to the company is far greater.
Well, I do try all of these arguments out in my classroom when I do this at the same university and trying to teach some of these value points and moral judgments that business managers will face in future when we have students in our School of Management. most of the time that the argument that I find difficult to counter is around meritocracy and is around equal opportunity. If we want to put forth claims of equal opportunity, then those who are meritorious people, who are the upper class, upper caste, urban, English speaking people in India, and they should also get the equal right. If they have got, I mean, most of the time, what students tell me, because they talk about the reservation system to begin with, easily they open up when they are to be roped in these kind of discussions in class. I bring in the topic of reservation, and their argument is, if I have got 90% and if someone else has got 55 percentage, where do we take care of meritocracy on one hand or equal opportunity on the other hand? Why would we give it, I mean, the seat to someone who has got just 55%?
Yeah.
And then the idea of human rights or deprivation and the long-term understanding of slowly and gradually changing it gets a backseat.
Yeah, so my question typically is that how hard have you looked? And again, the class and privilege argument that, what the people with the privilege, whether it is a white community in the US, whether or Europe, for example, or it is the Brahminical upper caste, upper class elite in India, and including the Baniya community, or if you look at a country like Singapore, where it would be the Chinese, and if you look at all those communities, it is, they think that they are there because of merit where they are. And my question is always, ask the people who are not part of your system whether they think the opportunities are equal. X has gone where he or she has gone because he or she thinks it is because of merit, but it is also because they've grown up in a milieu, in an environment where certain skills were prized and certain skills were encouraged, and that kind of environment was created at home, which allowed them to study and read. And if you look at a Dalit child or a Muslim child, the context is very different because they're often first generation learners. So for them, there is an ambition and there's an illusion of the opportunity. But I mean, it's a bit like getting someone to run with a rucksack behind them with 20 kilos on their shoulder, and then they're not going to be able to keep up. Then you cannot put them on the same starting line. Then the starting lines have to be different. I mean, people understand that in every walk of life and society. And so when people say that there is equality, I mean, I would say, okay, let's go and ask the Muslims and the Dalits if they think there is equality. One has to look at the Rajendra Sachar Commission report in India, for example, to look at the real statistics of, is it really the case that Muslims are better off or not? And that is the way to look at it. And that is the reason why Manmohan Singh's remark, which has been very crudely mischaracterized, he said that the Muslims have the first right to development. There's a context in which he was saying it, and that is being completely missed here. I mean, my point would be that, look at the IAS class in India, look at the top judiciary in India, look at the corporations in India, and do you find, and look at and accept the fact that a lot of the business in India are family owned, which itself biases the situation. Now, how many people do you see who are not from the same class, same caste, same religion, same background as you are? And if you're doing well, wonderful, all full marks to you. And if you're doing such that you do have a lot of Dalit employees, but they are all in the lower echelons of the company, then you have a problem at hand. That why is it that they are not becoming managers? American companies thought long and hard, and they have made substantial progress towards both blacks and the minority and the women. When I was a student at Dartmouth College, I'm talking about mid-1980s, at that time there were probably one or two black CEOs and one or two women CEOs of Fortune 500 companies. Today there are 30 or 40 each. Now, is that enough? No, it is not enough. But is it better than what it was in 1980s? Oh boy, of course it was far better than then. Does that mean that we can declare victory and go home? The answer is no. Are those companies which are run by these inclusive and diverse management worse than the other ones? The answer is surely not. I mean, Google is run by an Indian. Microsoft is run by an Indian. I mean, just imagine if they were. My point is that, ignoring diversity is something against the interest of companies. And if they say that, we are only meritocratic, they're taking an extremely short and narrow point of view, which in the long run, they will lose out in a really open and competitive environment.
Absolutely. But I will take it to one more layer inside the business concerns. And business concerns, when it comes to human rights and workers, working conditions, would have to be worried about the trade unions. So, and particularly the trade unions in India have opposed the recent labor law reforms, claiming them to be anti-worker because it makes it easier for businesses to hire and fire workers while making collective bargaining more difficult for the workers. So, I mean, in general, also unions and unionization are looked at very critically with the burgeoning growth of the private sector, as we have seen. So, is unionizing a human right, according to you? And should businesses consider it?
Yes, so if you look at both the International Covenant, if you look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and if you look at the ILO Tripartite Declaration, which goes back to 1920s, in fact, it's even before the Universal Declaration which came out in 1948, the right to collective bargaining, the right to form a union are fundamental rights. They are what ILO calls them core conventions, and almost all governments have it, all countries have it. Some don't, but those are not model countries in any way. I mean, let's put it that way. Uh, the reason is, again, we go back to that power argument I was saying, that, one entity has power and the rights holder does not have the power. The one with the power is the duty bearer. Now, it's very easy to say that, let's negotiate with each worker individually to look at his or her individual needs and accordingly create a pay package. But that creates resentment. You and I do similar work, and yet you get slightly more money. I mean, you may get more money because of seniority. Now, that's a good, understandable principle, or performance related. But if it is done merely because I came 5 years later, or I was not related to somebody in the company, that is a problem. That will lead to attrition and so on. So I think the non-discrimination is a core principle. So when workers decide to come together, it's because they do believe in equal work for equal pay and equal treatment, even across genders. And so therefore, the right to form a union is legitimate. Now, I do understand some unions are highly politicized. They can be very violent, but that's a separate issue. I mean, you do not form a worldview of a multinational, for example, based on Union Carbide in India in 1984, right? You could say that you could look at Union Carbide in India in 1980 and say that all companies are bad, all foreign companies are bad, and kick them all out. That would be terrible. I mean, it would be, by the same token, if you take a trade union leader who's incredibly violent, and I mean, I grew up in Bombay, and I know we had some fairly fiery trade union leaders who were difficult. But does that mean all unions are like that? I mean, you are in Ahmedabad, Mazdoor Mahajan has a very long tradition. Now, some people will say that it's not strong enough. Arvind Butch and all the work that they were doing was not strong enough, and they should have been more militant. But Seva, Workers Cooperative, again, formed with what Ilaben is doing. Ilaben Bhatt, again, is woman-led union. Is that something to be banned or shunned, or should be encouraged? So I think unions are responsible. In fact, a lot of the workforce is not unionized. One reason we had a problem of all these migrant workers walking hundreds of miles was because they were non-unionized when the lockdown was declared and there was no safety net for them. And those are the most vulnerable, most marginalized, and most discriminated against workers. So unionization is essential. But of course, like all negotiations between two parties with power, there has to be trust, and that requires understanding, listening, treating the other with dignity, and so on.
Yeah, but when the right to collective bargaining, and I come to my ideas, I, as it is, wanted to pick it up in our conversation on the collective bargaining the farmers are trying to put forth with the government of India presently, the Kisan Andolan. How would you review in the light of human rights considerations? Or if I can also couple up one more query with it, and therefore the immediate next that comes to my mind is this right to speech, because last couple of days everybody has been reading about and has been making informal comments about what has happened around the comments by Greta Thunberg and Rihanna about either the Kisan movement in India or the right to dissent. Rihanna also not even clearly referred to the farmers. She just said that what is happening to the idea of dissent and why dissent not easy. What is so bad with dissenting and expressing disagreement? So does it not point at the right of people to speak on the social media, and what can one speak, what should one not speak, the free speech versus hate speech? And hate speech in itself is a huge area now. Where should a line be drawn between the hate speech and free speech? Or it also throws in a question like right of women to speak. Is it different than right for men to speak, and right of people outside India to speak about India? There's so much that is.
No, no, absolutely. No, each of these are, I mean, these are all extremely profound questions. So, I mean, it'll be very difficult to give glib responses to them, but let me try. I mean, let's leave aside the merits of the argument. Should Indian agriculture be reformed or not? Or should there be a minimum support price or not? I mean, those are important debates to be had separate from that. But just on the narrow question of do farmers have the right to be consulted to policies that affect them? The answer is yes. Have they been consulted properly? The government says yes, they say no. That means we have to listen. There's a communication failure there. And three, if they want it to be pushed back and do something else, do they have the right to say that? Yes. Are they peaceful? By and large, they have been peaceful. There have been a few cases of violent incidents and all that, but by and large, it's been a very peaceful and very well organized protest. In a democratic society, is there a room for that kind of a protest? The answer is yes. So to that extent, the Kisan Andolan is absolutely justified. You could even make the case that the anxiety that the farmer has, that if the minimum support price goes, and we are not talking about the so-called rich farmers of, just not just Punjab, but even in the Kheda district, for example, and we can talk about that. But we're not talking about that. But if you're a small and marginal farmer, it's very easy to say, here's your mobile phone, check the price of which mandi is offering you the best deal, and company A gives you X price per quintal, company Y gives you Y, go and sell your product to Y. And this guy has only a bullock cart. How is he going to ferry his product there? He needs some kind of a local support mechanism. It's not all transactions can be done on your cell phone, but the goods still have to be moved. So those anxieties are extremely real. So one needs to listen. Now, I'm not a farming expert or agricultural expert, but I think those voices have to be heard and spoken. So yes, free speech matters. And free speech matters for everybody. I mean, on one hand, yes, it's right to say that, should foreigners speak about India? And I would say, why not? Because Indians speak about other countries all the time too. Myanmar had a coup and the Prime Minister in India expressed grave concern over that. That's interfering in Myanmar affairs. Right? When India offers a law which says that if you are any religion other than Muslim from Pakistan or Bangladesh and want to seek refuge in India, we will give it to you. It's interfering in Pakistan and Bangladesh's affairs. I mean, in a way. So, I mean, India does that all the time. India has Tibetan government in exile, which India allows, which is an interference in Chinese affairs. So the government does it all the time. We all know, and this is no secret, but Akshay Kumar is a Canadian citizen, and he routinely speaks about what India should do, and nobody seems to mind that. Then why should it be a problem when Rihanna does it? Now, I'd like to unpack that. I mean, are we being racist here? Are we being gender discriminatory here? Are we saying that you have to be born in India to be able to speak on India? In which case, I can suggest several other people who are born in India, who live abroad, have foreign citizenship, have a critical view of India. Will they be able to do so? So these are the ways to unpack. And the final part, hate speech and what is hate speech? It is a difficult. Now, hate speech is saying that people of religion A are mad. That is hate speech because it expresses hate towards that community. But there's something called dangerous speech, which is to say people of religion A are mad and therefore they should be jailed or they should be killed or you should go after them. So the call to action, which raises an imminent threat of violence. And once hate speech becomes dangerous speech, then the state has to act. Right now, what has happened is that anybody who feels slightly hurt immediately goes to the police and goes to section 124A and talks about sedition, saying that this is sedition. Now, sedition was a trial that in Ahmedabad, Gandhi was, Justice Broomfield, the famous case at the and he was in the trial, which is known as the Sabarmati trial. It took place in Gujarat at that time. And he was tried by a colonial power for a person who was fighting for his or her freedom. Today, people are being banded around sedition trial cases for simple things like drawing a cartoon or sharing something on Facebook. And so I think the law has reached way beyond where it should. It does need to be curbed. It's for the good of all the people. And because so long as the criticism is expressed peacefully so long as it's not a call to violence, and so long as it is, does not violate some of the other norms of, gratuitously insulting a group or a race, I think there should be sufficient freedom in that regard. And of course, women have the right to speak. I mean, that's I mean, obviously, no question about it. Yeah. I mean, if people are upset about Rihanna speaking out too much, are they upset about Kangana Ranaut speaking too much? That's my question.
Right. But taking it back to the businesses, then in a nutshell, I'm still trying to put it together. What is it that a business should do? Start looking for people, talented people who are coming from the more vulnerable communities of our society. Uh, it is difficult to find them, is what an argument that the business houses would probably easily resort to, or make a draft of policy. And not that business houses do not have the policy considerations. The way the government has some draft and it is zero draft, it's going to still see the light of the day. We don't know when. Business houses also have certain policies around working conditions and employment related concerns. And yet, when it comes to the diversity and inclusivity, we in India, businesses are far away from reaching a point where we can happily hold the head high and say that there is something which is positive. So where would you want the businesses to begin in terms of some concrete steps?
So I think they should move from this whole idea of reservation as a very negative connotation, right? That we create a quota. What businesses should look at is learn from what the Americans call affirmative action policy, which basically means you say at the, in your ad at the bottom that, we have a strict policy of non-discrimination, and we actively encourage candidates from unrepresented minorities to apply. And I think that's the kind of, and then commitment to look out for that. So when you are hiring people, in the pool of people being interviewed, if you have very few women, make sure there are women. If you have very few people of a particular religion, make sure that they are in the pool. Now, of course, final decision you make, of course, has to be of the right candidate for the job. But if there are two candidates and the margin of difference between their abilities is relatively small, then obviously go out and give the opportunity to the one who has not been represented, because the one who is from an overrepresented community will find it far easier to get the next job as against the person who has reached as high as he or she has done. And I mean, when people who are kept out of the purview and ignored, and then when they're given a chance to perform, they shine. I mean, look at Indian cricket team at Gabba, right? I mean, if we had a different captain and a different set of cricketers, this result may not have been possible. And yet you have someone who's a rickshaw driver's son, somebody whose father had died, bringing India to a glory. So if the cricket team can, show India at its best in its diverse way, I'm sure so can every Indian organization do the same.
Well, I mean, that's quite a message. That's quite a message to all of these budding business entrepreneurs and managers of tomorrow, that we have to start looking for people. And when we start, if we try it out, we are going to find people. It's not that we will not find qualified Muslims or qualified Christians and qualified Dalit Christians and qualified women and qualified queer. I mean, it's a very small proportion.
And the queer part is in a way hard, because I'll tell you why. It's not because of any particular reason, except that it's what we call an invisible minority.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, you cannot look at a person and say whether the person is queer. It's an orientation which we come to know if the person feels safe to express their identity. And what kind of an organization would it be if the people who work in that organization don't feel safe to say who they are? That's the problem.
So what would an organization do to make those people feel safe?
So what a lot of companies in the West have done is the ally program. Okay, so what they do is that if there is an LGBT employee, they have to basically come to the company and say that, look, what are your policies? And then the company then starts not monitoring it, but tell them that, look, we have an LGBT network which is open, feel free to join, and there will be non-LGBT people, the so-called heterosexual or heteronormative people will also be there, and they will be your allies. And I think it's extremely important for people who are allies to speak out and support just as, men can help women advance in their careers. And just as, in theory, Hindus can do that for Muslims, upper caste can do for Dalits. And I'm not trying to create a hierarchy here. I'm only saying that those are the elements who have privileges and the others have lacked the privileges, although they have the rights. And so how to make sure that they're enabled to realize that right, that is the thing. And I think that's exactly what needs to be done with the queer. And it's harder because of the invisibility question. And that's why the company has to listen rather than impose.
Absolutely. I think we can now also start looking at the questions. Number of participants have been sending questions. We have a few questions in our...
Yeah, it's a long list. I can see that.
Yeah.
I'll leave it to you to decide. Yeah.
Certainly. Indeed, a variety of questions are there in the chat. And I'm sure all the audience is waiting to hear the views of our speaker on the questions today. So I would want to begin with a question which is by Vidhi Nayak, which slightly talks about a lot of things that our youngsters, or rather a platform that our youngsters, and in fact all of us are using all the time these days. So Vidhi says, in an era where most discussions around human rights are held online, on social media platforms, is it a legitimate worry that most of us are marinating in our own echo chambers and there is no serious change that is happening with words that are exchanged online? Rather, it's leading to a growing extremism. So
yeah, it's absolutely a great question. And I think you're on the ball with that. I mean, it's absolutely true that instead of, internet giving us more information, actually it is narrow casting us, and we are all retreating to our echo chambers. And I think we will find it in terms of the people we follow on Twitter, people we look and read on Facebook and so on. And I think the only thing I can suggest is, for having that wider access, is that just as in the past, and I hope people still buy newspapers, otherwise some of us who write for newspapers will go bankrupt and broke. But we used to read several papers. I grew up in Bombay, and we used to get Janmabhoomi, the Gujarati paper, but we also used to get Indian Express and Times of India and Economic Times. So one was a corporate, one was establishment, Times of India, and Indian Express was always a radical one. And not that everybody read every thing in the newspaper, but at least it gave you an idea of the wider opinion world. The algorithms of social media prevent one from doing that. I agree with that. And I think that's why it is more important to start following those who are different and whose views are different. I think people are not doing it enough. And I know COVID makes it harder because, we don't go out much and it's impossible at least. But to seek out and listen to other points of view, it may really anger people. On the internet, people, there's a lot of latent passive-aggressive anger that comes out. But listening and reading is fine. I do read both left-wing and right-wing publications. And I think that's one reason it helps me come up to the conclusion, which may in the end be liberal, which is what I am. Which it may end up being there, but at least I'm able to listen and recognize. The example would be the child labor example we gave. I could have given a very classic progressive radical view that child labor should be banned. But I know that that's an impractical thing. It would be unfair to everybody, particularly the children who will do worse forms of labor. And one reason I was able to persuade myself to think of other views on this and other matters is because I listen to other points of view. And I think everyone has to do that, should do that, ideally.
Indeed, Salil, I think you have raised a very important point about the interesting way, if I may use the words, the interesting way in which these algorithms tend to work a lot of times, that they will make us see what we want to see or what we keep asking for more and more.
Push you to more extreme.
And push you to move in a certain
see one story. So when Amanda Gorman, this young poet, read out her poem at Biden's inaugural, once I clicked on that and I saw that video, my Facebook feed was full of more and more about Amanda Gorman, and then assuming that I'm interested in young poets, other young poets' feeds started coming in, or black poets. And I'm no problem with that. Now, this is a very benign example. I'm pleased that I got to read all these black poets and all of that. But but the assumption was being made that, okay, I must like this and therefore that. Yeah.
Absolutely. I think it's also in your response, you have put a very important point for our young audience today to look at multiple sources of information on the same point or the same issue that is being discussed. Do not look at only one source or not depend only on one side of the story. It's really a very important way to open our horizons for any issue and be able to think openly. To think, sorry, I think it was muted. To think with an open mind. The next question that I would like to take up and then post that, Chirag, if you would want to pick up any. There's a question by Professor Sonal Yadav, who is our colleague. With increasing privatization, the concept of union has disappeared. Hire and fire policy has been implemented by private organizations. Employees are on receiving end as there is hardly any freedom of speech. What would be your opinion on this?
Yeah, so it is a genuine problem. And I think there was another question about gig workers. And those are the things that, as the industry, as we move from kind of an atomized setup where, unions become less relevant, um, it's there, and privatization kind of feeds into that principle. But I think the right to form a union is still a fundamental right. And if there is it would be pretty hard for a company to say that we are not going to have you. They will try to come up with ways of creating several smaller units of fewer employees so that they can get away with it. But as we all know, that any factory or any organization which has too many small, the whole advantage of the law of large number and economies of scale goes away from that. So that said, I think I'll go back to more of a normative and principle response here, that a company that does not listen to its workers, a company that does not and treats them as merely cogs in a wheel, will ultimately have higher rates of attrition, will have workers leaving the company for other companies faster, and retraining and hiring people again is going to be far more costly for companies. So yes, short run, a lot of these policies might make sense, but if the company wants to survive and survive in the long run, having and having a union does not mean friction. It just means that you're listening to the people who are coming into your workplace 8 hours a day. And I think it's a natural thing to do.
Yeah, I mean, I was looking at the questions. I very carefully now got a chance to look at the questions. And there's one from our colleague at the School of Management, Amol, where Amol is asking about how will we be able to conceive of and actually concretize the idea of a Dalit Chamber of Commerce. Will that be some kind of a strategy to be able to ensure the rights of those who are marginalized?
So yeah, so two parts. I think there is. I mean, I don't live in India, so I'm not that familiar. But I think there is a Dalit Chamber of Commerce to start with, and to some extent, it does make sense that for Dalit businessmen to come together, the businessmen and businesswomen to work together and develop. But we don't want Dalits to trade only with each other. The whole notion idea is integration. And because the idea is integration and make sure that it should be FICCIs and CIIs of the world, which should make sure, we should seek from within. And why is it that they have so few Dalit entrepreneurs? And they should ask themselves, why is it that the Dalit businesses have to create their own chamber of commerce? And, and try to eliminate that need. So as a short-term measure, yes, such a chamber would make sense. And there is one, I believe. And therefore, what you need to do is to strengthen it more and, look for it. But again, not in terms of quota that, we'll give 25% of our contract to Dalit businesses. That doesn't help. I mean, that's not the way to go for it. How to reorient and rethink. Ultimately, what any organization has to do is look at its workforce and see whether it looks like the country it is a part of, or whether it looks like the community to which they belong.
Well, then immediately what we can connect with is another question that Sudhir has dropped on the chat box. And earlier he talked about CEOs and activism. But in another question, Sudhir says, don't you think the heritage of human rights privileges Western ideals of individual freedom and personal dignity in contrast to values of family and collective identity and community harmony in places like India? So we have had our very different sense of human rights and dignity in our own varnashram, if I'm extending so this question, and if I would want to take it to that. How would present day businesses be able to strike a balance between both one traditional cultural baggage that they are bringing with them, and then the Western education and the Western philosophy influencing? If you think human rights, as suggested by Sudhir, is a heritage of Western ideals.
So first of all, I wouldn't call it a Western ideal because the biggest human rights struggle in India was started by men from Porbandar, right? A Gujarati called Mohandas Gandhi, and he with other Indians. I mean, but he was a preeminent figure there. And if we look further and further back into the origins of human rights, we will find that some of the values, I'm not saying all, and I'm going to make a very strong case for the universalism here. But even if we go back to Ashoka and his stambhas and stupas, what he has written about human and animal rights, of course, he has done it after the Kalinga War. So that's he has already committed a genocide to start with. But after that, when he has this Damascus movement and he changes from that perspective, if you look at it, those ideals are very, very much part of Asian traditions. I mean, or Indian traditions, whichever way we want to look at it. So to give the notion of human rights as a Western concept, then how do we explain Hitler? How do we explain Stalin? How do we explain Churchill with the Second World War and what he did to the famine in Bengal? I mean, those are not Western values. The Westerners bristle when you say that Hitler or what the white community did to the Native American community in the United States. That was a genocide too. So to say that human rights is a Western concept is misleading. The more interesting debate is individual rights versus collective rights. And I think there is some logic to it. But if we privilege individual rights too much, then yes, the individual becomes separated from society, which is never very desirable. But if you place collective rights very important, then you have the system of China, where a bamboo shoot that grows up is the first to be cut off. And that's why you have this little guy standing in front of tank at Tiananmen, and nobody knows where he is. Liu Xiaobao, the poet, who goes to jail and dies on medical parole at the end of it because of his cancer. That's the so-called, that's the Confucian ethic, right? Or communist ethic of family being more important than the individual. So I think families are important as social organisms, but individuals are at the center because they are far more vulnerable than a group is. So I genuinely don't think human rights are a Western construct. I mean, this is like Gandhi was once asked, remember that by a British reporter that, Mr. Gandhi, what do you think of Western civilization? And he said, yeah, that would be a good idea.
Right. I, I look at two questions which are really interesting. There's one by Aditi, and that's on violation of human rights eventually creating some kind of mental health issues for certain stakeholders. Aditi, would you like to turn your camera on and ask the question yourself? And then I would also invite Chandra Siluri. That question is also, I mean, primarily it's about the reservation and caste-based reservation. But her question leads us to an inquiry into, should businesses then have a reservation policy? Because on the other hand, we are talking about ending the caste-based reservation in India.
Yeah, I wanted to ask whether there are many organizations who necessarily don't follow human rights policies, wherein employee may face a mental health concerns. So, provided the employee can be very much, capable of and very much um, qualified to work in an organization, but provided the employee must have had a mental issue. So, in that case, due to the mismanagement of the organization, what the organization primarily role should be, and in case the let's say the employee may not be capable of working efficiently in the organization, so he would definitely need a pay at the end of the month. So this is a very complex situation. So how should the organization deal with the employee due to
They
their
should,
mismanagement?
they should see it. This is a need for remedy. That there has been a violation. There is a violator, so the company must take steps to ensure that whoever did suppose this is because of harassment, as you put it here, and therefore intimidation and bullying. then whoever does the intimidation or bullying is either disciplined or removed from the organization, or at least the supervisor subsidiary relationship is broken up at that time. And then the remedy comes in, I mean, if somebody is physically ill, suppose I'm at workplace and, the ceiling falls on me and, I get a fracture, of course the company pays for it, right? I mean, that's expected. So then why make a restriction here? So it should be seen, I mean, if it is indeed leading to mental illness, then of course offering counseling and support, compensating, all that becomes part of the issue. And I think responsible organizations do it when there are class-based, I mean, the class suits and class action suits on discrimination in the US, companies have made remedies by offering benefit to everybody, not just to that individual, because if it's a systematic problem, it's not just that one woman who was being bullied, there must be 20 other women who are bullied. So you make a class at. So those are the costs that companies have to bear when they overlook human rights protection. And I think they need to be sure and make sure that it doesn't happen.
But if there is a human rights, it's not followed in an organization, is the management has to be, the management should be responsible, even if the highest the highest member of the organization is to be responsible, because he has to oversee everything, all the roles, so it
Yeah, so I
becomes a
think
very complex situation.
so
Even if a manager doesn't follow the human rights policy, let's say,
yeah.
human resource, So, but at the end of the day, the CEO has to be responsible. So
So it happened that way. One recent case was with one large Indian company where there is a gay employee and he was being bullied by a woman manager. And he took the case to Twitter. It became a public story. And that woman employee was fired. And I think they made some settlement with the gay employee. And this is with a large Indian company that I'm talking about. So I think in that case, the management took the right steps at that time. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Indeed, I think it is, at the end of the day, in any given situation, it is for an individual at whatever position he or she may be to realize, think, and do what is right, more than anything else that may or may not have been said on paper. There is also a question by Chandra Silori, and he would want to unmute and ask the question. So, Chandra, would you please?
Thank you so much. First of all, thank you for this very fascinating discussion about how human rights are addressed in the private sector, in different sectors. My question is more about, this caste-based reservation policy that has been continuing for almost 7 decades in the country. So, and then it sometimes, is not very fair with the qualified candidates and all. And we hear a lot that, the non-qualified candidate or those who perhaps may not fare good are getting the opportunity to move on or progress in the profession. But, then, the question of where is the end of it, basically? Do you think that this policy is going to continue forever? Or do you think there is going to be any change? As we have been hearing that, reservation should be an economic base rather than the caste-based system. So is there any, do you see any change in the policy or any end to the caste-based reservation system in the country?
So, okay, this is a long response. It can be a very long response, but I won't. But my question would be that, has caste-based discrimination ended in India? That would be my counter question. People are talking about an instrument to set it right, saying that it is time to move on. But has the problem been eliminated or not? I mean, if I look back at what happened in Una in 2017 or 18, where Dalits were, stripped and beaten up. If that is the way in which Dalits are still being seen, by people like Rohit Vemula have to end their life, have we really fixed that problem? Has India as a society said that, okay, now there's no more discrimination? Can it honestly be said that way? If that cannot be said, then the next question would be to ask people within the Dalit community that, do you think that only qualified people are rising? Or do you think there are qualified Dalits whose resumes are not even being seen by the employers? So a lot of this data needs to be seen first, analyzed first. before people say that, oh, we've done it for 70 years and it's now time to move on. Because if that were indeed the case, then we would see a very different India, which we are not seeing. We are still seeing an India which is only slightly different from the way it was in 1947. And if that is where we are, then I think clearly the policy, the way it is implemented, hasn't worked. And one reason it's probably that it's only applied to the public sector and not applied to the private sector. So I'm not therefore saying that the whole thing has to move to the private sector and have a reservation policy there, but at least move towards the affirmative action principle by trying to seek out actively candidates. And yes, it will be hard. It is not easy, because when we move in our own social circles, it's very hard to meet somebody not like us. I mean, I'm a Gujarati from Bombay, and a lot of people I know in Bombay tend to be Gujaratis. I mean, I know other people too. I mean, it's not saying that. But if I fail to look at my own database of friends and see how many people are not like me, who didn't study like me, who are not from my ethnicity, and if I find that the number is a good one, then that means I'm able to eliminate my biases. But if everybody I know speaks my language, went to my school, from the same community, same religion, then there is a problem. And I think that's what the managers need to explore first before they can say that, oh, we fixed the problem, now we are qualified candidates or not. The qualified candidate who's not getting that job is because it's someone you know. But what about the qualified candidate you do not know because of his or her caste barrier? That's my question. And it's a question, frankly, even all private organizations have to do it. And I mean, far from it be for me to suggest what a university should do, but Ahmedabad University, very frankly, should look at its own profile of academic, that how many of them have studied abroad versus studied in India, and how many of them are from particular ethnic groups or social groups or caste groups, and have they made that difference, and have they, if they've not made, have they looked for the candidates? But this is, I mean, partly in jest, but partly seriously, yeah.
Indeed, Salil, that's a very, very valid point you have raised, whether it is universities or companies or institutions. One should think about.
I write for newspapers in India, and my question is always, how many newspapers have Muslim, Dalit, or women editors? And the numbers are low. Numbers are low or non-existent. And I think it's a question worth asking. How many of them are those who did not go to Stephens or Presidency or Sydenham or Elphinstone College, but came from other backgrounds? I think those are the kind of questions we should be asking ourselves.
Certainly. Again, brings us to the same point of thinking about what is right, what is the right thing to do, or the right decision to take as a decision maker in any situation. The answer is always there with us. It's just a matter of how fearlessly we implement that answer which is coming. Although I think partly, just one more last question which is here from Himanshi there, although I would think it has partly been answered already. Nevertheless, if a student is from scheduled tribes and he gets an admission on the basis of that and not on the basis of merit, and basis of family background was as okay in general, so does this violate human rights?
So my question would, my question will be, whose rights are violated? I think one of the problems here, if we all look at this business of quota, if you look at it, it's a demand-supply disequilibrium, isn't it? I mean, one reason people are resenting other people getting, people who are not like us, quote unquote, us getting into these jobs and positions, is because of the assumption that, there are only so many seats. Why not expand them? I mean, I know there has been an expansion of IITs and AIMS and National Law University and so on, but let it be everywhere. And I think if there are more such organizations, more universities are opened up, private sector, public sector, cooperative sector, whichever way you want to look at it, then I think we won't be having the discussion, because I think the people are resenting because I want to be a doctor and I resent it because someone from a quota gets to become a doctor. But fine, let there be another university. Now there will always be the problem that I can't be a doctor at AIMS, but I have to go to another college. But it's the same way here in America that, I would love to study at Harvard, but Harvard is not open to me because I'm not, and they have, of course, an affirmative action policy, but it doesn't mean that they've lowered their standards. So I go somewhere else. There are other places which are very good.
Absolutely. I think rather than focusing on the idea of who belongs to which caste or which area, merit should always be the focus. And in fact, at individual level, if we start thinking this, as an individual, if we start thinking, where can my efforts take me, rather than, whatever birthright or legal right I have, probably that will really be the competition of equals. And that's where everyone will frankly get to see the real picture. So, uh, very, very wonderfully explained, Salil. On that note, I think we are on time at 8 o'clock in the Indian Standard Time, 8 p.m. But how can we close this conversation without hearing something that you enjoy doing very much and which many of us have been looking forward to, which is poetry. So anything that you would like to share with us today? We would very much look forward to it.
Okay, now that's yeah, I was prepared for that, so that's not the problem. We've talked about fairly hard and serious things. So, let me turn to a poem which is slightly funny to start with. Then I'll read one that got me into some trouble with Twitter some time ago. And then I'll end with a poem in Gujarati, because I suspect quite a large number of the people I've been looking at the names seem to be Gujarati. So, but this
wonderful.
Yeah, the first poem is called, it's about a food fetish, and it's genuinely a funny poem, so it should not be taken as a serious poem at all. But it's about, how people say, okay, I don't want this and I don't want that in my food, and that becomes almost a nightmare for most people who host other people, particularly Indians. And, I'm myself notorious. I mean, those who follow me on Twitter and Facebook and those who know me know that I have this visceral dislike of kothmir or cilantro or coriander. So that also features in this. So here we are. There's beef in my biryani. Send it back. Send it back. There is pork in my lasagna. Your waiter should get the sack. There is coriander in my curry. How dare you, I tell you. There's yogurt in my gravy. I'm vegan, I told you. There is onion in my bhaji. I'm a Jain, don't you know? There's chicken in my patties. I'm a veggie, I will throw. I can take the garlic stew only on Saturdays, you fool. There's rum in my Coke. That's not fair, that's not cool. There are nuts in my salad. Are you certifiably mad? I'll sue you in all courts, or I'll go and tell your dad. Why the paratha in my thali? You know I don't do gluten. I'll go and tell your mother that your food is all rotten.
Yeah.
Okay, now the other is serious.
Thank you so much. This was nicely done.
What a subtle way of giving such an
As
important
you said,
message.
it'll be a food poem, lighter poem, but it was actually not. So
no, I know the point was to bring
Wonderful.
the mood down to something less grave. We'll be talking about very serious things. That's why I thought I'll do that. But the other one is a serious poem. This is a poem I wrote about my mother. She died in 2004. And I later wrote this poem, I think, in 2006. And it's the poem with which my first book, Offense the Hindu Case, begins. And I had read it out in New York University in 2010. And I put that video up. And on the 5th of December, which was the night before the 6th of December, which is, of course, the day Babri Masjid was destroyed. And soon after that, some people complained and I was out of Twitter for about 48 hours. But anyway, that raises another free speech and corporate power story. But that's not what this is about. But this is that poem. My mother's fault. You march with other 7-year-old girls, singing songs of freedom at dawn in rural Gujarat, believing that would shame the British and they would leave India. 5 years later, they did. You smiled when you saw Maqbul Fida Hussein's nude sketches of Hindu goddesses and laughed when I told you that some people wanted to burn his art. Have those people seen any of our ancient sculptures? Those are far naughtier, you said. Your voice broke on December 6, 1992, as you called me at my office in Singapore when they destroyed the Babri Masjid. We have just killed Gandhi again, you said. We had. Ahute karai koi divas? Can anyone do such a thing anytime? You asked, aghast, staring at television as Hindu mobs went house to house looking for Muslims to kill after the train compartment in Godhra burned, killing 58 Hindus in February 2002. You were right each time. After reading what I've been writing over the years, some folks have complained that I just don't get it. I live abroad. What do I know about India? But I knew you, and that was enough. And that's why I turned out this way. And one of your former professors at AU, Pratishtha Pandya, she did translate it in Gujarati. So, but I don't have it with me here. So
I have heard the Gujarati version online, Salil. You have
Okay.
recited it online, and it's so touching. And that's where I kind of searched more for information on the kind of things you write, and it just got better as I went along, looking at more things.
Right.
Yeah, so Salil, this one I'm hearing for probably the third or fourth time, and it's a very different charge. So as I had shared with you that if time permits, even I would share one of my poems.
Sure.
But here, after listening to this one, I would go to an English one that I had written, and I had written about 6 to 8 months back, which is also partly about India, but also partly indirectly referring to what we have been discussing today in the conversation. This one is called Half-Baked Cakes. Selling isn't easy, is it? Cakes will have to be buttered, baked, garnished, you see. Cakes are different. Cakes are different in my country, They'll ask you if then you're a Parsi baker, a Cyrus is the name. Cakes, if you sell, eggless you must make. Cakes are different in my country, I sell dreams, discounted, cheap. That's easier many times than selling cakes. Following my dispositions like a cur who sold his master. I sell epochs. Colonialism is easy, modernism with some icing needed, socialism like hot cakes. Cakes are different in my country, My body, cross-hatched with isms and eons, backs me always. I sell time then, diaric. Priceless as polluted air, I sell nation, motherland veins. Religion I sell, salvation is damned. I sell land, earth vanishes. People I sell, buy them for cut rate from the wholesale. Humanity hangs on the signboard. Fun it is to sell cakes to people. Funny to sell people to cakes. Cakes are different. For the gullible world, I sell companionship, together with loneliness. Promises with an asterisk. I sell everything: love, life, fates, future, breath, diseases, death. Tonight you must come to me. Come to me. I am going to kiss you truly. Topple you over like a sinking boat kissed by a stormy wave, plunge and submerge. You'll then kiss the ocean. Ocean I have not yet sold. Bite salt, drink ocean, meet people who are sunken there, who consume the cakes, those cakes, with the universe to be my ink pot then, and that ocean water, my ink, I will write you a love letter.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Wonderful use of the cake. Yeah.
Absolutely lovely, Chirag. I think I'll have to revisit this and listen to it again, certainly. Salil, you were saying that you would want to recite one in Gujarati, if I'm not, or was that the one?
Gujarati is still on the. I don't know.
Sorry.
I mean, yeah, I can do that. I mean, let me try. Yeah.
Sure.
I mean, if that's okay, if you, I'm sorry, I don't have an English translation to also read later, but I mean, I think those who follow Hindi may be able to get a bit of it, and I'll read a bit slowly. So this is about.
Absolutely.
This is about, the man whose face is on every currency note in India, Gandhi. And, the fact that he continues to prick Indian conscience every time because he reminds India of what it could be and should be and what it often isn't. So this is about that. And it's called Have to Thawa Do Humne Azad. Let us become free now. 100 વર્ષ પછી જોહાનિસબર્ગની કચેરી સામે જ્યારે તમે દેખાતા હશો છટાદાર, ઊભા હશો ટટાર અને ચાલતા જશો એકલા ન્યાયાલય તરફ, ત્યારે એ લોકો આવી તમારા કાળા પૂતળાને ધોવડાવશે. કારણ તમે શ્યામલ નથી, શ્વેત છો. કાળા નથી, ગોરા છો. ત્યાંના નથી, અહીંના છો. ક્રાંતિકારી નથી, બાયલા છો. શિલ્પ નથી, બાવલા છો. અને તમારી પ્રપૌત્રી આવશે ત્યાં બાલદી, પાણી અને સાબુ લઈને અને હળવેથી ધોશે ને ભૂંસશે એ ધોળો રંગ. કારણ કે નિષ્કલંક શાંતિદૂતને સફેદ રંગ શા કામનો? તોડી પાડવું છે પૂતળું તો તોડો, તમે કહ્યું. થયા ખુશ? મળી શાંતિ તમારા મનને? તમે એમને પૂછ્યું. સરસ. અરે તમારું જીવન અને તમારું સત્ય કંઈ પૂતળામાં થોડું સમાવાય? તમારે તો હજુ જોજોનો પાર કરવાના છે, એકલા ચાલવાનું છે. કોઈ આવે સાથે કે ન આવે, ઝેરના કટોરા પીવાના છે. નથી કોઈને ખબર છેલ્લો કટોરો ક્યાં છે. અમને તો રસ છે તમારા ચશ્મામાં. અમે તો બનાવી દીધા છે તમને દેશના સાફસૂફીના કર્મચારી. અમારી ચલણી નોટો પર જોઈએ છે તમારી છબી. અમે દાટી દીધા છે તમને રાજઘાટમાં. તમારી ઉપર એટલા બધા જથ્થાબંધ ફૂલ ફેંક્યા કે જેથી તમે બહાર જ ન નીકળી શકો. અને ફૂલની સુવાસ અને અગરબત્તીની ધૂમ્રસ્વેર તમારા શ્વાસને રૂંધવે, ચડાવે ઘેન. સુતારો તમે, ઊભા થયા અને પાછા આવ્યા તો શું જવાબ આપીશું અમે તમને? 150 વર્ષ થઈ ગયા, હવે તો તમે જાઓ. તમારા પૂતળા તોડીએ તોય તમે હાજર. રસ્તાના નામ પાડ્યા, ટપાલ ટિકિટો છાપી, ફિલ્મો બનાવી જેથી અમે તમને ભૂલી જઈએ. અરે એક ગામમાં તો ગોડસેની મૂર્તિની પૂજા પણ કરી અને એક બાઈએ તો તમારા ફોટાને મારી ગોળી. દે ધનાદન, લાલ રંગ જે ફેલાયો જમીન પર. તોય સાલું તમારું મોં મલક્યા કરે, જાણે કશું થયું જ ન હોય. શરમ નથી આવતી? તમને મરે 70 વર્ષ થયા, હવે તો થવા દો અમને આઝાદ.
Brilliant, brilliant. What an expression. And again, what a candid way of expressing the feelings. Friends, how could I be left behind?
Yes.
And how could our very own national language, Hindi, be left behind? So while we have heard poems in English and in Gujarati, there is one which I have in fact just written during this conversation, listening to all the things that we have been talking about. And again, it just brings me to one single thought as I've been repeating, that it's all with us. Sab kuch hamare saath hai, hamare andar hai. So very quick there, and then we wrap up this lovely conversation. अगर दुनिया सुधारनी चले हो, पहले शुरुआत खुद से करो. अगर जिंदगी सुधारने चले हो तो शुरुआत किसी और से करो. मत रुको ये सोचकर कि क्या फर्क पड़ता है. मैं ये करूं या ना करूं. खुद से ये कहो कि जो सही है, जो सच है, उसका साथ देने से या वो करने से मैं क्यों डरूं. हर कोई आखिर इंसान है, चाहे वो घर में, दफ्तर में या हो बाजार. क्यों ना ये सोचकर सब एक साथ चलें, क्यों ना ये सोचकर साथ निभाएं और बने एक दूसरे का आधार. So on that note, thank you very much, Salil, for your time. Thank you, Chirag, for taking up this conversation so beautifully. I just want to go back to one sentence which Salil started the conversation with, where he said, Treat others as you would like to be treated. And in anything that you do, put yourself in the other person's shoe and think that ways as far as possible. And there, if every single person does this, human rights will automatically take care of themselves. Thank you very much, all participants, for joining. And we look
Thank you.
forward to have all of you here again in our future webinars as well. Thank you, Salil. We will all be in touch with you from Ahmedabad University. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Have a wonderful weekend.